Hello friends, good morning all of you. So today we are going to discuss very important topic in our neuroanatomy. So before going to see this topic, before going to dive into this white matter of the cerebrum, so please subscribe to my channel to see the new videos of neuroanatomy. So I'm extremely sorry for not posting any videos in last 2 days. Please excuse me and just let us go in deep into this white matter of the cerebrum. So this white matter of the cerebrum is also called as nerve fibers of the cerebrum. So coming to this nerve fibers, in the previous class, means during the discussion of the cerebrum, we have seen the outer part. We can see the gray matter. Just below that gray matter, we can identify the white matter. So the gray matter we have seen the when you discuss the structure of the cerebrum, we have seen different laminae, the neurons, which type of neurons are present, large pyramidal neurons, small pyramidal neurons, then the neurons of causal. These are all the structures we have discussed. Now coming to the white matter, just below this cortex, cerebral cortex of the cerebrum, we can find the white matter. So what are the types of white matter we are going to see? So let us see that. So coming to the classification of the fibers, classification of the white matter. So when we see the white matter or the nerve fibers, so according to the myelination, there are two types of fibers are there: myelinated fibers and non-myelinated nerve fibers. So all the fibers which we are going to see in the cerebrum, all fibers are myelinated fibers only. Okay, there are no non-myelinated fibers strictly. So many of the fibers are myelinated and are derived from the axons of pyramidal cells of the cerebral cortex. Then coming to the classification of the nerve fibers, there are three different types of fibers are there, white matter. They are association fibers, projection fibers, and the commissural fibers. APC. You can remember this mnemonic APC. So association fibers, projection fibers, and commissural fibers. Coming to the association fibers, there are two different types of association fibers are there. One is short association fibers and second one is long association fibers. So what do you mean by short association fibers? So the short association fibers, they are connecting two adjacent gyri of same cerebral hemisphere. So the association fibers are the fibers which connect the gyri, means in the same cerebral hemisphere. So when you take the two cerebral hemispheres, in each cerebral hemisphere we have so many gyri. So they are connected with each other in every cerebral hemisphere. When you take the left cerebral hemisphere, we can find the prefrontal gyrus, precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus. You see in the frontal lobe, we can identify superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, and the inferior frontal gyrus. So this short association fibers, they are connecting adjacent gyri of the same cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so when the fibers are connecting the gyri of same cerebral hemisphere, they are called as association fibers. Okay, association fibers, they connect the same cerebral hemisphere, the gyri of same cerebral hemisphere. So that is about the short association fibers. When you move to the long association fibers are, so that is about the short association fibers. Moving to the long association fibers are long association fibers. For example, for this long association fibers, they negotiate the gyri which are separated from one another by considerable interval. Okay, so the two different gyri which are far away, these fibers, long association fibers, are connecting the far away gyri. So when you see the short association fibers, they are connecting the adjacent gyri. When you see the long association fibers, they are connecting the gyri which are away from each other, which are very distant. Okay, so example for this long association fibers are cingulum. Cingulum is an arched association bundle of the limbic lobe and lies within the cingulate gyrus. So where we can identify the cingulate gyrus? So to see the cingulate gyrus, we need to take a sagittal section of the cerebrum and try to identify from the medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere, so that we can identify the corpus callosum, this green color one. Just above the corpus callosum, we can identify the gyrus called as cingulate gyrus. So just above the corpus callosum, we can identify the callosal sulcus. Then callosum, above the corpus callosum, the cingulate gyrus is present. Then superior end of the cingulate gyrus, we can identify the cingulate sulcus. Cingulate sulcus. So what is present in the cingulate gyrus is the cingulum. Cingulum is it. What is cingulum means? It is an arched association bundle of limbic lobe. Okay, arched association fiber. Let me show you that. So they are extending from anterior to posterior. The fibers are arising just below the rostrum of the corpus callosum, and they are extending posteriorly like this. Okay, they are extending posteriorly and reaching to the parahippocampal gyrus. Reaching to the parahippocampal gyrus. Okay, this is how these fibers are extending. So the cingulum forms a part of Papez circuit for emotional integration. Papez circuit of Papez circuit for emotional integration. The next one which we are going to see is uncinate fasciculus. Uncinate fasciculus, it is also called as arcuate. So what about this uncinate fasciculus is? It is a type of long association fiber. Long association fibers. They hooks around the floor of stem of lateral sylvian fissure or lateral sulcus. Okay, so lateral sylvian fissure or lateral sulcus, and this uncinate fasciculus is connecting area number 44 to area number 22, which is present in the superior temporal gyrus. Superior temporal gyrus. So the long association fibers, uncinate fasciculus, which is extending from area number 44, which is present in the frontal lobe, and the fibers are extending posteriorly in this way. Please try to observe this, and it is connecting the area number 22, which is present in the superior temporal gyrus. That is about uncinate fasciculus. Next, we are going to see the superior longitudinal fasciculus. Before going to see that, this is an image for uncinate fasciculus, how it is extending from area number 44 to area number 22. Okay, so this is about the uncinate fasciculus. Then coming to the superior longitudinal fasciculus. Superior longitudinal fasciculus, which is extending anteroposteriorly above the insular area, and outside the projection fibers, of the corona radiata. Okay, so what we can say is it is lateral to the corona radiata fibers. What do you mean by corona radiata? We are going to see shortly. Okay, just lateral to the corona radiata, this superior longitudinal fasciculus or superior longitudinal fibers are present. Okay, how they are extending? So it is extending from anterior to posterior, from frontal lobe to the occipital lobe. So from frontal lobe to the occipital lobe, we can identify it is connecting area number 10 and the area number 18. Okay, area number 10 to area number 18 and 19. Okay, so that is about superior longitudinal fasciculus. So perhaps this fasciculus is one of the connecting links between the occipital and frontal eye fields. Occipital, which is present posteriorly, and frontal eye fields. Then, so this is how this superior longitudinal fasciculus is extending. So not only these superior longitudinal fasciculus of fibers are connecting frontal and occipital lobe, but also some fibers of superior longitudinal fasciculus, they extends anteriorly and reaches to the temporal lobe. Okay, that is about superior longitudinal fasciculus. This is a scanned image of the superior longitudinal fasciculus. So we are seeing only one set of fibers which are extending from frontal lobe to the temporal lobe. Okay, that is about superior longitudinal fasciculus. Now moving to the inferior longitudinal fasciculus, it is extending longitudinally along the lateral wall of the posterior horn of lateral ventricle, outside the fibers, the optic radiation and tapetum of corpus callosum. Okay, the fasciculus connecting the area number 18 and 19 of the occipital lobe with the most of the areas of temporal lobe. So try to observe this diagram. So from area number 18 and 19, it is extending towards the temporal lobe and connecting occipital lobe and the temporal lobe. Okay, so this is about inferior longitudinal fasciculus. So the next one is fronto-occipital fasciculus. Fronto-occipital fasciculus, it is also extending antero-posteriorly from the lateral pole to the occipito-temporal lobes. Lateral pole to the occipito-temporal lobe. So here you can see that it is extending from frontal pole to the occipito-temporal lobes. Frontal pole to occipito-temporal. It is also similar with that of superior longitudinal fasciculus. Superior longitudinal fasciculus. So it is a compact and lies medial to the corona radiata. Remember that fronto-occipital fasciculus is present medial to the corona radiata, whereas superior longitudinal fasciculus is present lateral to the corona radiata. This is the difference between fronto-occipital fasciculus and the superior longitudinal fasciculus. Okay, so these fronto-occipital fasciculus forms a subcallosal bundle and occupies the interval between corpus callosum and the lateral border of caudate nucleus. Lateral border of caudate nucleus. The subcallosal bundle conveys the projection fibers from the cerebral cortex to the caudate nucleus. Okay, let us see one by one. Okay, so till this time we have seen the different types of long association fibers. So the long association fibers, one we have seen cingulate we have seen, then we have seen uncinate fasciculus, then we have seen superior longitudinal fasciculus, inferior longitudinal fasciculus, and the fifth one is fronto-occipital fasciculus. Then moving to the next one is the projection fibers. Projection fibers, they connect the cerebral cortex with the subcortical gray matter of the basal ganglia. Okay, projection fibers, they connect the cerebral cortex with the subcortical gray matter of basal ganglia, that is thalamus, then with the nuclei of the brain stem and the spinal cord. Okay, the projection fibers include both corticofugal and corticopetal fibers. Corticofugal and corticopetal fibers. So the projection fibers of allocortex, try to see see this image. So they are connecting from the cerebral cortex and they are connecting to the basal ganglia, subcortical gray matters of the basal ganglia. Here you can identify the substantia nigra, caudate nucleus, lentiform nucleus, thalamus. So these are all connected by these projection fibers. Projection fibers. Okay, so the first one example for this projection fibers is the corona radiata. Corona radiata. So this word is disturbing a little bit in this entire world nowadays. Corona corona. Okay, remember corona means it is a crown. Okay, corona name itself, it is crown. So because the projection fibers, they appears like the crown, that's why they named it as like corona radiata. From the entire neocortex, the projection fibers converge to the periphery of corpus striatum. The fan-shaped arrangement of the fibers thus formed is known as the corona radiata. Let us see that corona radiata fibers. So in this picture, we can identify the full brain, and we are going to take up a small part of the brain out at the level of this lateral sylvian fissure, and this small part we are going to take away. Yes, yeah. So that we can identify the hidden part called as insular cortex. Insular cortex. So here we can identify the gray matter, and just below that we can identify the white matter. This white color one, that is nothing but the white matter of cerebral cortex. So let us see that after that we have removed the hidden insular cortex as well, so that we can identify the corona radiata. So the above fibers are called as corona radiata. So they are corona radiata fibers which are extending down. They are reaching to the outer border of the outer border of the corpus striatum, and the joins with the internal capsule fibers. The joins with the internal capsule fibers below. Then ultimately below that it is going to join with the fibers of crus cerebri. Okay, these are the fibers of corona radiata. You can see the shape of the corona radiata is like a crown. These are the internal capsule fibers, and these are the crus cerebri. So moving to this, yeah, here you can see the outer margin of the lentiform nucleus, that is putamen. Putamen we can identify. Here you can see that the corona radiata fibers which are extending down and reaches to the outer margin of the corpus striatum. Okay. So here you can see that corona radiata fibers, how they are extending from the cortex and they are descending down and reaching to the outer margin of the lentiform nucleus. In the lentiform nucleus, already have discussed in the basal ganglia, outer part is called as putamen. So it is reaching to the putamen, right? Then the corona radiata intervenes between the fronto-occipital fasciculus medially, laterally, superior longitudinal fasciculus. You can see here fronto-occipital fasciculus I'm showing you here. Then it is the medial relation of the corona radiata. Lateral relation of the corona radiata is superior longitudinal fasciculus. You try to remember only this much. Okay, so internal capsule which divides the corpus striatum almost completely into caudate nucleus on the medial side and the lentiform nucleus on its lateral side. That we are going to discuss in a few minutes. So this blue color one, they are nothing but the corona radiata fibers. And these fibers we can identify superior longitudinal fasciculus. And these fibers, this yellow color fibers, they are inferior fronto-occipital fasciculus. Moving to the next one is internal capsule. Internal capsule forms a main highway for the input and output fibers of the cerebral cortex. And it is a compact band of neocortical projection fibers, and it is a V-shaped band. We can identify that it is a V-shaped band, and the concavity is directed laterally. The internal capsule is continuous above with the corona radiata, as I have told you earlier, and pressed below the capsular fibers occupy the crus cerebri. Let me show you. Yeah, here you can identify these are the fibers of internal capsule. Above it is joining with the corona radiata, below it is joining with the crus cerebri. Okay, then the space occupied by the internal capsule is bounded medially. Try to see the internal capsule over here. So it is bounded medially by the thalamus, head of the caudate nucleus, and the thalamus, and laterally we can identify the lentiform nucleus. So this part is called as the lentiform nucleus. So medial to the internal capsule we can identify anteriorly the head of the caudate nucleus, posteriorly we can identify the thalamus, and laterally we can identify the lentiform nucleus and the insular cortex as well here. Okay, so between the lentiform nucleus and the insular cortex, we can identify external capsule and extreme capsule. Two capsules we can identify. Two white margins can you find over here? So they are nothing but the external capsule, and here you can identify the V-shaped band is called as internal capsule. Okay, so coming to the parts of internal capsule, what are the parts of internal capsule? The parts of internal capsule are anterior limb, posterior limb, genu. Then we can identify the retrolentiform part, and sublentiform part. Simply you remember anterior limb, posterior limb, genu, retrolentiform part, sublentiform part. 5 parts, very easy to remember. So let us dive into this anterior limb. What are the fibers are present in this anterior limb? So anterior limb we can identify corticoponentine fibers. In the anterior limb we can identify corticoponentine fibers. Cortico means cortex, ponentine means pons. Okay, so cortex means in the cortex we have different lobes, as you all know that. Frontal lobe is there, parietal lobe is there, occipital lobe is there, temporal lobe is there. So if the fibers are coming from the frontal lobe, they are called as frontoponentine fibers. If they are coming from the parietal lobe, they are called as parietoponentine fibers. If they are coming from the occipital lobe, they are called as occipitoponentine fibers. If they are coming from the temporal lobe, they are called as temporoponentine fibers. Ultimately, corticoponentine fibers, in that corticoponentine fibers, we have four different fibers are there. So they are named according to their arising place. Okay, respectively. Suppose if they arise from the frontal, they are frontoponentine fibers. Now coming to this anterior limb of internal capsule, which is present. What is the location of anterior limb of internal capsule? It is present between caudate nucleus, head of the caudate nucleus medially and the anterior part of lentiform nucleus laterally. Okay, so medially it is related to the head of the caudate nucleus, laterally it is related to the lentiform nucleus. Then the posterior limb, which is lying between thalamus medially and posterior part of lentiform nucleus laterally. Okay, genu is bend. It is a curved bend between anterior and the posterior limbs with the concavity of the bend facing laterally. Then retrolentiform part lies behind the lentiform nucleus. Lentiform nucleus. Sublentiform nucleus, which is present below the lentiform nucleus. Now moving to the corticoponentine fibers, which are present in the anterior limb. So let us see that. So where they are going, how come these structures are going? The corticoponentine fibers, first they are going to the pons, and then from right side to the left side. Okay, they are going in a so they are going to the pons, then they goes to the opposite side cerebellar hemisphere. So that's why these fibers strictly called as corticopontocerebellar fibers. Corticopontocerebellar pathway. Okay, so the pathway is first from the cortex, and then they entrance into the internal capsule. From the internal capsule, through the internal capsule, the fibers are reaching to the pons. Then from the pons, they goes to the opposite side cerebellum. If the fibers are running from right side cerebral hemisphere, they reaches to the right part of the pons. Then from the right part of the pons, they enters into the left side of the pons, and they goes to the left side cerebellar hemisphere. Okay, that's why it is called as corticopontocerebellar pathway. Then coming to the pyramidal fibers. So the pyramidal fibers arise in the cerebral cortex and relay in the lower motor neurons within the brainstem and the spinal cord. The pyramidal fibers are of two types. One is corticonuclear fibers, then corticospinal fibers. So the corticonuclear fibers synapse or relay with the contralateral motor nuclei of cranial nerves, which innervate the head and neck muscles. So the corticonuclear fibers occupy the genu of internal capsule. So the frontoponentine fibers, they are occupying the anterior limb of internal capsule, whereas the genu part is occupied by corticonuclear fibers of head and neck. So these corticonuclear fibers, they innervates of the muscles of head and the neck. Then moving to the corticospinal fibers. Corticospinal fibers synapse with the anterior horn cells of the opposite half of the spinal cord, which innervate the muscles of upper limb, and which innervates the muscles of the trunk, which innervates the muscles of the lower limb. So most anteriorly we can identify the corticospinal fibers, which are innervating the muscles of upper limb. Posteriorly, the corticospinal fibers, they are going to innervate the lower limb. In between, we can identify those corticospinal fibers, which are going to innervate the muscles of the trunk. So that is about the pyramidal fibers. Pyramidal fibers. Now going to the extrapyramidal fibers. Extrapyramidal fibers arise in the cerebral cortex, rely in the subcortical gray matter belonging to the extrapyramidal system, that is red nucleus, then substantia nigra, then corpus striatum. Okay, etc. So they are named according to their destinations. Suppose if they goes to the red nucleus, they are called as uh, corticorubral tracks, corticorubral pathway or corticorubral tracks. If they goes and reaches to the corpus striatum, they are called as corticostriate. Okay, from cortex to the corpus striatum. If they reaches to the substantia nigra, it is called as corticonigral. Corticonigral. So these are the three types of extrapyramidal fibers arise in the cerebral cortex and rely in the subcortical gray matter. Okay, so most of the fibers, they occupy the position near the corticospinal fibers in the internal capsule. Okay, in the internal capsule only. So means strictly speaking, they are occupying the posterior limb. Extrapyramidal system, it is occupying the posterior limb of internal capsule. Coming to the sensory fibers are mostly thalamocortical fibers. Thalamocortical fibers. Let me show you this thalamocortical fibers. Okay, thalamocortical fibers which radiate from the thalamus. From the thalamus, try to observe here. From the thalamus, and they are reaching to the cortex. Okay, from thalamus to the cortex, they are passing through the internal capsule. Passing through the internal capsule. So, they which radiate from the thalamus in different direction to reach the widespread areas of the cerebral cortex and constitute most of the thalamic radiation. So, what do you mean by thalamic radiation? Means from the thalamus, these fibers, they are taking the impulses to the cerebral cortex, okay, through internal capsule. Okay, so that is about the thalamic radiation. So the other fibers contributing the formation of thalamic radiation are corticothalamic fibers. Corticothalamic fibers. According to the direction of these fibers, the thalamic radiation is divided into different groups. Different groups. One is anterior thalamic radiation, which is present anterior to the thalamus. Then superior thalamic radiation, which is present superior to the thalamus. Then inferior thalamic radiation, which is present below the thalamus, and posterior thalamic radiation present posterior to the thalamus. Now, coming to this thalamic radiation, where exactly this thalamic radiation is present in the internal capsule. So, the anterior thalamic radiation, the fibers of anterior thalamic radiation are directed anteriorly and connects the anterior and the dorsomedial nucleus of thalamus to the frontal lobe cortex. Okay, so they are occupying the anterior limb of internal capsule. Then superior thalamic radiation is occupying the genu part of the internal capsule and as well as the posterior limb of internal capsule, whereas the posterior thalamic radiation, which is occupying retrolentiform part, okay, retrolentiform part of the internal capsule. Then the inferior thalamic radiation, which is occupying the sublentiform part, So this is blindly we can remember that. Okay, then moving to the next one is the commissural fibers. Coming to the commissural fibers, the one which we are going to discuss mainly is the corpus callosum. Then we'll try to see the anterior commissure, posterior commissure, hippocampal commissure, and habenular commissure. These are the 5 different commissural fibers we are going to discuss. Okay, so the first one is the corpus callosum. If we take the sagittal section, we can identify a C-shaped band, a thick band which we can identify at the medial surface of cerebral hemisphere. That is nothing but the corpus callosum. It is the largest commissure of the brain, connecting the cerebral cortex of the 2 cerebral hemispheres. Since it connects the neocortex of the 2 sides, it attains enormous size in the man. So it is 10 centimeters long, nearly half of the anterior posterior length of hemispheres and consisting of 300 million fibers. In the corpus callosum itself, we can identify 300 million fibers we can identify. Then moving to the features of corpus callosum. So the moving to the features of the corpus callosum, we can identify the corpus callosum forms a massive arched interhemispheric bridge in the floor of median longitudinal cerebral fissure connecting the medial surface of two cerebral hemispheres. So moving to the parts of corpus callosum. So from anterior to posterior, the parts are, first we can identify the small part which is present just below this thalamus, below the thalamus, and we can identify the fornix over here. First part of the corpus callosum is the rostrum of the corpus callosum. This narrow band is called as the rostrum. Then this curved anterior bend is called as genu. Then genu is continuing as the trunk or body of the corpus callosum, and most posteriorly it is called as the splenium. Okay, rostrum, the narrow band, then genu, the curved bend, anterior bend, then we can identify the body or trunk, and most posteriorly we can identify the splenium. Okay, so these are the parts of corpus callosum. Okay, genu, rostrum, trunk, and the trunk or body, and the splenium. So in this cerebral hemisphere, you can identify this narrow band is rostrum, curved band genu, trunk or body. Then this is the splenium, most posteriorly. So coming to the anterior curved bend, the name is genu. This genu is present 4 centimeters posterior to the frontal pole of cerebral hemisphere. Then the splenium, which is present 6 centimeters anterior to the occipital pole. 6 centimeters anterior to the occipital pole, we can identify the splenium. 4 centimeters posterior to the frontal pole, we can identify the genu. Okay. Then moving to the next parts. So what are the structures, what are the fibers are present in the corpus callosum? So in the corpus callosum genu, we can identify a thick curved anterior extremity of corpus callosum, that is genu. The fibers which are present here are, so U-shaped small fibers which they are present, they are connecting the frontal lobes of right and left cerebral hemispheres. So commissural fibers, they are connecting right and left cerebral hemispheres. Association fibers connecting in the same cerebral hemisphere, the gyri are connected with each other by association fibers. Right and left cerebral hemispheres are connected by the commissural fibers, whereas the projection fibers connecting from the cerebral cortex to the other parts of the basal ganglia, other parts of the brain. Okay, now we are seeing the commissural fibers. This genu carrying the forceps minor fibers which are connecting the frontal lobes of right and left cerebral hemispheres. Then coming to the rostrum, the genu extends downwards and backwards, a thin prolongation to join the lamina terminalis. I will show you the lamina terminalis here. So here you can see that lamina terminalis. Okay, so the fibers which we can identify here are, they're connecting the orbital surfaces of the frontal lobe. The fibers are connecting the frontal lobes of right and left cerebral hemispheres. Then moving to the trunk. The trunk is main part of the corpus callosum between its thick anterior genu part and the posterior splenium part. Okay, so the fibers we can identify in this section, we can identify the curve is present superiorly. So the right and left cerebral hemispheres are connected by the band fibers of they are passing through the trunk or the body of corpus callosum. Then the splenium is a massive posterior extremity of corpus callosum. This is the massive posterior end of corpus callosum. It is lying 6 centimeters anterior to the occipital pole of cerebral hemisphere, and it overhangs the thalamic pulvinaris pineal gland. So here you can see, I will show you this. It is overhanging the thalamic pulmonaris, and the pineal gland, tectum, tectum, tectum of the midbrain, and we can identify even the posterior commissure, posterior commissure. So that is about the corpus callosum. The splenium fibers means the fibers of the splenium, they connect the posterior parts of the parietal lobe and temporal and occipital lobes of two cerebral hemispheres. The fibers connecting the occipital lobes sweep backwards on either side above the calcarine sulcus, forming a large fork-like structure called as forceps major. Okay, anteriorly through the genu, forceps minor fibers are passing. Posteriorly, we can identify forceps major fibers are passing. Okay, forceps major fibers forms a swelling in the upper part of the medial wall of the posterior horn of lateral ventricle called as bulb of the posterior horn. Bulb of the posterior horn. Then other fibers which we are calling them as the tapetum. So the tapetum is the thin lamina of the white fibers. Here you can identify. These are the fibers called as tapetum. Tapetum means the thin lamina of white fibers which forms the roof and lateral wall of the posterior horn and the lateral wall of the inferior horn of lateral ventricle. So the tapetum is formed by those fibers of trunk and the splenium of corpus callosum which are not intersected by the fibers of corona radiata. In the coronal section, the tapetum looks whiter than the surrounding white matter because the section passes parallel to the fibers of the tapetum. Okay, just remember the tapetum are nothing but a thin lamina of white fibers which forms the roof and lateral wall of the posterior horn of lateral ventricle. That you remember regarding the tapetum. So next, other commissural fibers are anterior commissure. So the anterior commissure, where we can identify this anterior commissure is, it is a small round bundle of white fibers which crosses the midline in the upper part of the lamina terminalis, So here can you identify this rounded bundle? So which is extending from the rostrum of the corpus callosum, and then it is present above the lamina terminalis, immediately in front of anterior column of fornix. It is present immediately in front of anterior column of the fornix. So this is nothing but the anterior column of the fornix. So anterior commissure consisting of two parts, two components, large posterior part, narrow anterior part. Okay, large posterior part, narrow anterior part. So this large posterior part is called as posterior neocortical component, which interconnects the lower and anterior parts of temporal lobe. So right and left temporal lobes are connected by the posterior part of the anterior commissure. So anterior commissure fibers connecting the two temporal lobes. Then the small anterior part of the anterior commissure which interconnects the olfactory regions, olfactory bulbs, olfactory tubercles of the two cerebral hemispheres. They are connected by this anterior narrow part, anterior small part of anterior commissure. Can you find this? So remember, this small part is anterior commissure. Then moving to the posterior commissure. Let me show you the posterior commissure. Posterior commissure is a slender bundle of white fibers, crosses the midline through the inferior lamina of stalk of pineal gland. Can you identify this pineal gland over here? So it is extending from the inferior lamina of the pineal gland. So this thickened part is called as the posterior commissure. So this posterior commissure interconnects the superior colliculi, pretectal and interstitial nuclei of the two sides. Remember, superior colliculi of right and left is connected by this posterior commissure, and pretectal part right and left connected by this posterior commissure. Okay, so that is about the posterior commissure. Then moving to the habenular commissure, I will show you another diagram. I will discuss about this habenular. Before that, I will just discuss about the hippocampal commissure. Hippocampal commissure interconnects the crura of the fornix. Here you can see that crura of the fornix. Crura of the fornix. So the hippocampal connecting the crura of the fornix, thus the hippocampal formation of two sides we can identify. So here you can see the right side, left side we can identify other part. Okay, in the opposite side we can identify the other part of the hippocampal commissure. Then the habenular fibers. Here you can identify the habenular fibers. So habenular commissure is a slender bundle. You can identify this is a slender bundle which you are identifying. I'm just showing with my pointer. That is nothing but habenular fibers or habenular commissural fibers. A slender bundle of white fibers which crosses the midline through the superior lamina of stalk of pineal gland, and it interconnects the habenular nuclei of two sides. Habenular nuclei of two sides. So this is the nothing but the commissural fibers. Okay, so this is the end of the white matter of cerebral hemisphere. So thank you, my dear students. If you have any doubts, please ask me. Please, you can do comment in my comment box. Thank you, my dear friends. If you have any doubts, ask me. In the next class, we are going to discuss about other neuroanatomy classes like thalamus. We are going to discuss. So please, once again, just have a look at it, and then come to the class. Thank you, dear friends. See you later.